Okay, so Lucy is there, Keith, in the chat, and is trying still to join, but we will make a start. Thank you everyone for joining us. We've got over 150 people here, I see, which is really fantastic. My name is Darren Hughes. I'm the Chief Executive for the Electoral Reform Society, and this event is being hosted by Liberal Democrats for Electoral Reform, and we're very grateful to them for the work that they've done to bring us all together today. We've got three great speakers talking on the topic of can a progressive alliance deliver PR after the next general election, and that's quite an interesting topic. It's worth us spending time talking about it because we've even put the term progressive alliance in commas, inverted commas, because there's different opinions on what that means. And for all of us who are supportive of PR, it's a good opportunity to use this time to discuss what we think we mean by these things and what the different routes to reform might be. We all know that we believe in it, but we also know what a hard task it is. So making sure we're all together, sharing our experiences and our views is a very important thing for us to do to make the most of the opportunity while there's a government at Westminster so firmly opposed to PR. Just a housekeeping matter that in the polls section of the platform, you can see there's a question, and that's if you, as you are listening to what you're hearing from LDER, from ERS and from Compass, if you'd like to join the mailing list of those organisations, that's the place where you can go and sign up to hear more after from what you've heard today, and I'll remind people of that again. Obviously, progressive alliances are things that have been talked about a lot over the last few years with such interesting and varied general elections, and have been more prominent even this year alone in 2021 with by-election results in Chesham and Amersham and Batley and Spen. And this does lead to the question, as I said earlier, what does it all mean? For organisations like Electoral Reform Society and Liberal Democrats for Electoral Reform, we desperately want PR to be on the agenda on and after the next general election at Westminster. But it is a conversation where there are different angles and views, and this is what we've come together for today. There are good signs of cooperation that abound, probably a recovery from the position of a few years ago at local level in Cambridgeshire. We'll hear from our speaker Lucy today, in Milton Keynes and in Oxfordshire, where parties are working together on the progressive side of politics to deliver for their communities. How do we grow that out? How do we take that further beyond that? At Westminster, there's an overlap on some policy issues, most notably right now, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, among others, are working on the elections bill to try and defend our democratic values from attacks on things like the Electoral Commission, voter ID, and even a sneaky amendment put in last week to revert from using the supplementary vote for metro mayors and police and crime commissioners to go back to first past the post, which is a very real concern that we're all going to fight very strongly indeed. In terms of England, it's becoming more clearer where the areas of commonality are, who the key challenges are in each seat. Arguably, there's only really one or two seats now where it's head-to-head Labour and the Liberal Democrats, and in a conservative-facing area, this is now much easier to see. And the work that ERS did with YouGov after the last election, where we asked people, what would you do if we had a preferential voting system like STV? Where would your second preference have gone? Well up into the 70s of 70% range of Liberal Democrat and Labour voters would have given their second preference to one of the parties that we talk about as progressive parties in this conversation. So we can already see things are moving in terms of where the voters are at. But this is not a walk in the park. It's not an easy thing to achieve. We do need to think about perspectives like where is Labour going under Starmer? What does it mean in Scotland in an independence frame? Where do the Greens fit into all of this? How are the Liberal Democrats feeling on the issue of power sharing coalitions after earlier experiences? So there's a lot of things for us to get into today. And so we're going to hear from our three speakers who I'll introduce just before they speak. And then there's plenty of time for Q&A, and you'll see the Q&A spot there. If you've been at the conference for the last couple of days, you'll have probably already used it already. And I'm pleased to say that Keith Sharp from LDER and Doug Cohen from ERS are going to be monitoring those questions, and will bring those up for us at the end. So our first speaker is Wendy Chamberlain MP. Wendy is the president of LDER, which is a really wonderful development because this was a portfolio area for her when she first came into Parliament until she became the chief whip for the Liberal Democrats in the House of Commons. So we're really pleased that someone of her enthusiasm and experience and insight has stayed with the cause of electoral reform and constitutional issues. And we're delighted that in addition to being MP for North East Fife, she's also a keen and vocal advocate for change to the voting system. So with that, Wendy, 7 or 8 minutes to set out your views on can the Progressive Alliance deliver PR after the next general election. Thank you very much, Wendy.
Thank you very much, Darren. It's lovely to be here today. And this is one of, for me, the real benefits of virtual conference, to see 170 people in this fringe event, something that would, even pre-COVID, be very, very difficult to do in a physical conference. So thanks, everybody, for taking the time to join this fringe. So the title, Can a Progressive Alliance Deliver PR After the Next General Election? And I'm afraid I'm going to be a bit of a sceptic in the time that I have, and I am going to look at it from a Scottish perspective in particular. Perhaps not to be unexpected, given that I was the only MP to take a seat from the SNP in Scotland in 2019, and dare I say it, quite a different political landscape in Scotland currently. But I suppose I'll start with just that old saying by Einstein, you know, the same thing and expecting a different result. And for me, Unite to Remain and the failure of Unite to Remain shows that potentially form a progressive alliance, particularly a progressive alliance without Labour, is not necessarily the right direction for us to achieve proportional representation. I think one of the concerns for me about Unite to Remain is some of the impact on local parties and candidates. Obviously, some of that was not helped by the nature of the snap general election in 2019, which meant that decisions were getting taken at very short notice. But there's no doubt that, you know, one of the reasons why I'm a Liberal Democrat is because of, you know, the say that members have and how the party works and runs, and the local party has such a key role to play in how our candidates are selected. So, you know, those local parties needed to be on board, and I think some of the timescales around Unite to Remain made that quite difficult. And I think just generally the different ways that parties work as well. I think the key stumbling block for me is that voters are not homogenous blocks. That's exactly why we want proportional representation. But I think it's very easy to get into a narrative where if there is a party not there, that their vote will go to the challenging progressive. And you did put it in italics, so I'll keep it going, Darren, the progressive party. You know, in Europe, we're obviously seeing a plurality of parties, and once you've stood down, it's potentially hard to get back in, even with STV. And I'm sure all the Lib Dems on here will have examples of times where potentially there has been some kind of agreement, and then actually our vote has collapsed accordingly. And Darren mentioned the recent by-elections, and I think those are quite telling for me, in that in both those by-elections, Cheshire and Amersham and Batley and Spen, all the parties stood. Labour stood, Liberal Democrats stood, and, you know, the voters made their choices regardless. And I think part of that is who is best placed to win was definitely part of it. In Cheshire and Amersham, we were had been second general election. We had won the town council in Amersham in May, and we were well placed. And people who, you know, obviously felt disappointed with the Conservatives, we certainly didn't expect to see the majority for Sarah Graham that we did, but I think that's testament to, one, the hard work that was done on the ground, no doubt about that, but two, you know, our strong message and that dislike of this particular Conservative government. And then Batley and Spen, now there was lots of comments about the fact that we should have stood down in Batley and Spen, but actually I would argue that if we had stood down in Batley and Spen, that might have meant, given the margin of victory for Labour in Batley and Spen, would have delivered a Conservative win. And the reason I say that is because we were very targeted on where we focused on in Batley and Spen. We focused in our good areas where we are Lib Dem Conservative facing, and we convinced soft Conservatives to support us. Now, if we hadn't been there, would those Conservatives have gone to Labour? I'm not convinced that they would have done. So actually what we did was helped ourselves in relation to council elections and made sure that we were seen and being active. But dare I say, I think we arguably did our bit in support of the Progressive Alliance there without standing down. And then in my last couple of minutes, then there's Scotland. As I've said, I'm the only MP to take a seat from the SNP in 2019. And in doing so, our seat saw the biggest fall in Conservative vote other than in the Speaker's seat. And that's because we didn't, nobody stands against the Speaker, and the lowest Labour vote share in Scotland. So we delivered that seat with the work that we did without a Progressive alliance. I think in Scotland, one of the other challenges is the Scottish Greens are a different prospect from the Green Party in England and Wales. They've got no prospects in Scotland of a seat at Westminster, so where would be the benefit potentially of working with them? And I think also the SNP have replaced Labour in many seats where turnout has historically been low and remains so. So I grew up in the west coast of Scotland in Greenock, where literally Labour weighed their vote when I was growing up, and those are seats that are now SNP, and they tend to have lower turnouts. So it feels to me quite difficult. But finally, I think the constitutional question in Scotland of the future of Scotland, either in or out with the UK, is the thing, as we saw very strongly at the May Scottish Parliament elections, operated under an additional member system, is driving where people finally put their cross. And actually some recent research by the think tank that Gordon Brown is behind, Our Scotland's Future, this week, demonstrated that actually Conservatives are willing to vote Labour or Liberal Democrat much more readily than actual Labour voters are willing to vote Conservative in relation to the Constitution. Now, if Scottish voters are putting the Constitution at the top of their list, the delivery of a Progressive alliance, what does that mean? Well, I'm happy to debate with people whether we think the SNP is progressive or not, but any alliance without Labour doing some degree of recovery, and arguably it's Labour that need to make that degree of recovery, without some of that recovery in Scotland, any sort of alliance or looking to build a majority involves the SNP and involves a commitment to another independence referendum, and that's certainly not something as a pro-UK politician I would be supportive of. I don't think that that for me is one of the key stumbling blocks. And then the final, because I'm where I'm coming to time, Darren, is Labour themselves. Are Labour supportive of PR? I'm not seeing any great indication of that. We obviously know that Labour conference is coming up. I know the fantastic work that Make Votes Matter and other organisations have done in relation to working with CLPs to bring a motion. But in my role as Constitutional Affairs spokesperson during the Labour leadership last year, I wrote to all the candidates during that, and then I wrote to Keir Starmer after his victory, and I've never received a response. We're obviously seeing some Labour MPs, such as Alex Sobel, now chairing the APPG for electoral reform. But, without Labour, I think it's very difficult to see how that a progressive alliance could work properly. And, I'm sure there'll be people who are listening in just now who remember Wimbledon and the Labour activists working in Wimbledon in December 2019 that potentially handed the seat to the Conservatives. So that would be my final thought, that Batley and Spen seems a better way of working than Wimbledon.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thanks for those thoughts, and also for the practical reminder of some of the things we have to negotiate to get around in order to make this happen. I'm really sure that we've got a call full of people who are supportive, but we need to work around these big challenges. You can't wish people to change their position. You've got to persuade them, work at it, and you identified quite a few big issues there that can't be glossed over. So some really good food for thought for us there. Lucy, if you're listening and you can hear us or hear me, if you are able to press that share button for your audio and video, then Doug or Keith can let you on. And also, if you're able to use Chrome as your browser, that might make it easier as well. But we're really hoping that you can join us, because we're very keen to hear about the work you're doing on the Cambridgeshire Council. So hopefully we will get to you. In the meantime, let's cross to Neal. And Neal, thank you for joining us. Neal's been involved for many years with directing and setting up Compass, campaigning for a democratic and sustainable society. And Neal, I'm sure that there will be people who would like to know just a little bit more about Compass as well. So if you want to give a minute or two on that, I won't take that off your time for your contribution. But thank you very much for joining us. You've got a different perspective on the Progressive Alliance, and we're really keen to hear what that is. Neal.
Brilliant. I won't talk about Cambridge, I want to talk about the Progressive Alliance. So thanks for inviting me, Darren, and thanks for all the work that you and the Electoral Reform Society have been doing. It's absolutely invaluable to the cause of us having a real and proper, decent democracy, and more power to your elbow. The essay question is, it was, can a Progressive Alliance deliver PR? Well, if anyone can tell me any other way of getting PR, then I'll accept it. If the question is PR, we're not going to get proportional representation under any kind of Conservative government. You know, they're obviously doing exactly the reverse, trying to impose first past the post everywhere across the country. So if we want PR, we've got to get rid of the Tories. If anyone can tell me, and Wendy, let's have this conversation because it's really serious now. It's really serious. How are we going to get it without parties collaborating? Labour are not going to win a majority on their own. You know, I'm a member of the Labour Party. I wish it wasn't so, but they're not going to get a 1945 landslide. They're not going to get a 1997 landslide. It doesn't look like they're going to come back in Scotland. They're going to be struggling in the Red Wall. It's hugely problematic. You know, they've got to win 125 seats for a majority of one. It's not going to happen. The only way it's going to happen is through parties working together. The question is, how do they work together to maximum effect? And we need a movement, a collaboration and a cooperation that's bigger than 1997. Go back to then. Ashdown and Blair talking, Cook and McLennan talking, lots of signals to the country around purpose, policy, direction. There was a mood of it's time for change. The Tories are old and tired. We need something new in. Now, I would criticise to death the New Labour track record on PR. You know, I go back to Mrs. Thatcher. You know, when asked should the Tories have a period in opposition, she said, no, don't be mad, because then Labour will introduce PR and will never get back in again. My party is ridiculously stupid when it comes to the electoral system, and we're going to test that next week in Brighton. 83% of members, over 300 constituencies have passed resolutions on PR. Biggest number of resolutions on PR going to the conference ever because of a really kind of brilliant campaign run by the ERS, Make Votes Matter, Compass, Open Labour, a whole load of organisations. So we're going to test, and we will know coming out of Brighton whether it's Keir Starmer who wants PR or not, because the votes are there. He can stop it if he wants to, and that will be very revealing. But we'll come back to that about kind of what we do about, you know, where Labour goes. But there is no, if the test is PR, then only a Progressive Alliance of some sort. What sort is going to maximise the anti-Tory mood within the country? I'm quite open about this because lots of people just think a Progressive Alliance means stand asides, and I don't think it does at all. I think it can do where local parties come to agreement together to do it. And I think they should be encouraged to do that. And I think there's a resolution or a motion tomorrow morning at your conference that's going to be discussing that. And I think that the party shouldn't do anything at all, which impedes the local ability of constituencies to decide whether they want to stand a candidate or not. And I think the example you were talking about, Wendy, was Richmond Park. And that's where a Progressive Alliance worked really well. The Greens stood aside and allowed the Liberal Democrats to win when, you know, and then, you know, and the difference is, Wendy, between by-elections where those signals can be sent very well, whether that's Richmond Park or Batley and Spen and Amersham, you can send those signals. They all get lost in a general election and you haven't got all your people ploughing in, because Richmond Park was then lost again in the general election straight afterwards. 97 very strong signals to the electorate above from the politicians, really fierce organisation. I was involved in putting Peter Mandelson and Chris Renard together that kind of did the deal on the seats. And so there was very strong tactical campaigning, and then that all engendered very strong tactical voting. We need 97 plus for the next election if we're to get a non-Tory outcome and therefore be able to pass PR legislation. And we've got much less than that. Much less, when there is so much overlap, Wendy, between what you believe and what I believe and what the Greens believe. And if we can't work together publicly and positively to make a virtue of the 80% of the things that we disagree with, we're going to end up with Boris Johnson, because that is the clear choice for this country at the next election. It's either going to be Keir Starmer with a Labour-led government, or it's going to be Boris Johnson. And while we agree on so much, we ought to be putting in place the signals and the structures to get the outcome that we want. So I think it's about intent. I think it's about purpose. We should be talking together and working together, and that's what Compass does all the time, trying to bring people together so that we get 75% of what we want and not 100% of what we don't. So let's build trust. Let's get you working where we can with your Labour people and Green people. We're trying to organise in every target constituency across the country, trying to get local activists from different parties working together. It's incredibly difficult because of all the tribal bound, issues that are involved. But as soon as we start talking together, we start working out that we agree with so much, and that there's, it's the other people on the other side of the pitch that we disagree with. And if we can't, keep kicking lumps out of each other, we're going to get nowhere other than a Conservative majority. So let's talk together. Let's work out how we do tactical voting. How can we do tactical campaigning? How can we do stand-asides? If that's the thing that's going to work. Because the upshot of another Conservative win, given the climate emergency, I've just come up to this meeting off the back of talking to and reading Paul Mason's book about how you fight fascism. I'm scared about what's happening to our democracy and what the Tories will do to our democracy if they get another term. This is so much bigger than whether the Liberal Democrats can double the number of seats or whether Keir Starmer can stand again. This is about the future of our country and our planet. And given that we agree on so much, surely we've got the wherewithal to work out how we can work together cooperatively to get that progressive majority that does exist in the country. I agree completely that people aren't blocks to be moved around from the centre and presume they're all lined up in the way that we want them to. This is about politics. This is about going out and making the case and talking to people nationally and locally about what progressives have in common. We have to make those arguments. We're all scared. The Labour Party is kind of, Keir Starmer running around going, if you want a Labour government, then vote Labour. Well, tell that to the people in the 80 seats where the Liberal Democrats are second to the Tories. If you want a Labour government or a Labour-led government, you vote Liberal Democrat in those seats for very good reason. And the same in some Labour seats. And we've got to find out what's in this for the Greens. So there's a huge amount to be done. We're behind the curve. We've got an election. It could be as soon as autumn next year, right? I mean, it might more likely spring 23. But my word, we've got work to do. Compass, working with others, we'll see who else wants to come on board with the Progressive Alliance, are going to make this happen. I'm absolutely determined that Boris Johnson is not going to be the Prime Minister after the next election, not just because I want PR and I want to change our democratic structures and cultures forever, but because I want to address inequality and I want to address the climate change. And we cannot lose again. We absolutely cannot lose again. And the only way we'll win is some kind of pragmatic progressive alliance. So let's make that happen.
Gee, thanks very much, Neal. Real tour de force there. We've heard from two great speakers who've thought about this topic a lot, but both of whom want electoral reform, and both of them are thinking about how we can get there and what the real politics are in the way. So it's going to be great to discuss some of these matters and get different views. I might come back to you, Wendy, but before, just on some of those points Neal made, particularly on the Labour dynamic. But also just to say that Keith is trying very hard for Lucy to join us so we can hear an example in local government where we'd like to see where there is already some cooperation going on and how that can change the dynamic as well, because one of our campaigns has been previously in Scotland to secure STV voting for local government there, and we're doing that work in Wales right now. So England remains another area where voting reform is very much a key issue, but obviously this discussion wants to draw on all these examples to see how do we get over the hurdle of Commons reform and what other ways we might be able to build to do that. I should also say that we're taking questions in the Q&A tab on the platform there. If you can see that, it's the fourth along, well, at least it is on my screen. I hope it is on yours too, but the letters Q&A should give it away. Wendy, can I ask you to come back and maybe reply on some of the things that Neal shared, thoughts that Neal shared with us?
Yeah, I absolutely get the passion of the arguments in terms of getting this Conservative government out. When I go back to the constitutional question in Scotland, you know, for me, the Conservatives under Boris Johnson are one of the biggest recruiting sergeants for Scottish independence. They are breaking down the devolution settlement. If we look at issues such as the internal market bill, and they are straying into the competence of both the Scottish and Welsh governments. And so, you know, I absolutely have sympathy with that position. I suppose where I remain entirely unconvinced is on where Labour actually are. Are Labour supportive of PR? I would accept that we're more likely to get PR with Labour than we are with the Conservatives. But the reality is you mentioned 1997, and if we go back to 1997, what was delivered by that behind-the-scenes cooperation between Paddy Ashdown and Tony Blair was an unexpected Labour majority that they then failed to deliver from an electoral reform perspective. So I suppose, you know, I joined the Liberal Democrats in 2015. I'm sure there are people listening in just now whose time in the party goes a lot further back than me, and potentially as a result are maybe even more cynical than me in relation to what Labour could potentially deliver. And you also talked about sort of it's more important than doubling our number of seats. And of course it is, you know, in terms of the direction of this country, especially what we've seen over the last decade. But there's no doubt that the Liberal Democrats will only make the gains that we would hope to make in terms of those 80 seats where we're in second place, with a degree of cooperation from Labour about not campaigning. And I actually think that's a more effective aspect to do with 1997 as an example, as opposed to a proper progressive alliance. So that's just some of my initial thoughts. And then I do, you know, I don't like saying all the time that Scotland is different, but there's no doubt that is driving the constitutional question just now, over and above what an idea of progressive is. And I suppose going back to that sort of final Conservative thoughts, you know, look at, you know, one of the key elements I believe of getting people engaged with electoral reform is demonstrating it in action. So we have in Scotland and Wales additional member systems. We've got Wales proposing to potentially move to STV for the Senate. We've got STV local council elections in Scotland, and Wales looking at it as well. And for those of you who are unaware, there's an instruction being laid before Parliament on Monday to increase the scope of the current elections bill that's going through Parliament. And that increase in scope is to make PCC and mayoral elections in England first past the post. So, you know, this is absolutely regressive steps from this Conservative government. And taking, dare I say it, it's back to that bit in terms of future of the UK for me, loosening some of those fundamental ties that bind, even about how we elect our representatives.
Thank you, Wendy, and thanks for the reminder of some of the progress that has been made, because it can be easy to be a little pessimistic sometimes about how the cause is going. But when you look across the UK, there are some good examples. There are some positive signs of where success has been achieved. We've got to just keep on going with it. But I also pick up, totally agree with you on that last point about the elections bill. Sometimes you not only get to move forward to the goal you want, you're being pushed back against the progress you've already made. And the elections bill is absolutely an example of that. And there's a broad coalition of organisations who care about democracy working on that. Neal, can I just come back to you on that? And then I've got Lucy's comments have been emailed to me. So while you're talking, I might just give a quick read of that, and then I'll read it out to the group. Thank you, Neal.
Yeah. Thanks, Darren. I think Scotland's obviously essential, and there's nothing going to guarantee Scottish independence more than another, a fifth straight, Conservative win at the next election. Nothing's going to do that more. If we go back to, there is no way you can see a different government than a Conservative government, other than with some kind of cooperation, some kind of support of the SNP, and there's no sign whatsoever that they are being diminished as a voting bloc in Westminster. So if we want to get rid of the Conservatives to stop Scottish independence, absolutely happening, then something's got to be done in terms of working with the SNP. There is no way around that. We have to face that political difficulty. Scotland was lost to the SNP, and it's not going back to anyone else anytime soon. So I think we have to accept that Scottish independence is on the table. If enough Scottish voters, returning Scottish SMPs, if there's a consistently big majority in Scotland, and let's talk about what that could be for independence, then as Democrats, we cannot deny that second vote. I think it's about the nature of that second vote, when it happens and how it happens. Because they're probably not going to do anything supportive in Westminster unless there is a promise of a second referendum. I'm not against a second referendum, because I'm a Democrat. But if we've got all options on the table, not just yes or no, but a third option about a radical form of federalism, if it's got, unlike the Brexit referendum, if it's not just about principle, but it's about the detail of what independence would mean, so people could look at it, and if it's some way down the line in the term of a non-Tory Labour-led government where we can be doing some stuff across the whole of the United Kingdom in terms of inequality, climate, public services, or whatever, I'm willing to take the risk. I mean, we should take it anyway because we're Democrats. I'm willing to take the risk that Scottish people would vote probably for more powers for Scotland, probably for some version of radical home rule. But I don't think in those circumstances they would necessarily vote for independence. But if they did do, it will be clear, it will be decisive, and we'd have to kind of live with it because we're Democrats. But that's the only way, again, we're going to get a non-Tory government, because the SNP support will be critical. And this is, we are living in the age of alliances. Look what's happened in Scotland between the SNP and the Greens. Look at the conversation in Wales. In Wales, between Labour and a party of independence, Plaid Cymru. Look at what was happening in Cambridgeshire, in Oxfordshire, in Milton Keynes, across the whole country. Progressives are beginning to work together because the electoral system forces us to do it. The nature of the Conservatives as they move to the right forces us to do it. The challenges of issues like climate change. Norway, all the Scandis have got alliance governments. Hopefully Germany is going to get a progressive alliance style government. This is the future, one that is negotiated and not imposed. We are going to have to work together if we want to beat our enemy and do the things that we want to do. And Scotland is difficult, but we're going to have to, because it's going to be thrown at us anyway, Wendy, isn't it? The coalition of chaos. They're going to accuse us of that, whatever happens. So why don't we have an answer to it? Why don't we say it doesn't have to be chaotic? It isn't. Alliance multi-party governments aren't chaotic in other countries. It doesn't have to be chaotic in the UK. We can, we can work together because we agree with so much and we're sensible, reasonable people. If we don't address these issues, then it will look like a coalition of chaos and we will deserve to lose because we haven't bothered to talk to each other and iron out how we do multi-party politics in a multi-party world. So we've got to face up to all of this stuff. It's difficult. We've got to be brave, but there is no other way around. And tell me what it is that gets rid of the Conservatives and puts us in a position where we can govern effectively.
Great, thanks for that, Neil. Lots of people to think about and chew over from that. And I'm absolutely delighted that Lucy Nethsingha has now joined us. So that was a perfect interlude. So Lucy, let me just cut straight to you for your remarks. Thank you very much for persevering with us.
Thank you. I'm so sorry it's so late. I've been having a technology nightmare, so it's great to be here at last, and I'm sorry for being very, very late for this. I have been here all along, kind of dipping in and out, trying to get here. Anyway, following on from what Neil was saying, I think there are a lot of people in this room who would agree that there needs to be a re-looking at how we work together, but I think the crucial thing is not whether we work together, because actually progressive parties do clearly need to work together, not just in the UK or in England or in Scotland or across Europe. We need to work together across the whole world to challenge the right-wing populist movement that there is across the whole world. But there are lots of different ways of doing that, and we need to be really careful about not just saying this is just about standing down in one seat, standing down in another seat. It's not simple. It's got to be we have to be really nuanced in how we do it, and we have to be respectful of what is happening in different places. And the long thing that I sent to Keith, which I'm not going to read all of, which I wrote earlier, starts off by talking about what it's like in my patch. So I run, I'm the leader of Cambridgeshire County Council. I am the leader of Cambridgeshire County Council on the basis of working with with Labour and the Independents. So we have the Lib Dems are the largest group of that joint administration with 20. There are 9 Labour councillors and 4 independent councillors, and we face a Conservative opposition of 27. So we would not be running the council if we didn't work together. But in my patch in Cambridge, the opposition is Labour. So every single year, I have to go out and persuade the voters in my area that they should vote for a Liberal Democrat rather than for a Labour person or a Green person. Otherwise, I will lose my seat. And there are no Conservatives in Cambridge City. There are plenty of Conservatives in Cambridgeshire, but in Cambridge City, there are Labour, Liberal Democrat and Green councillors. And we have to realise that that's what it's going to be like in Cambridge, and that in Cambridge we're going to have to fight each other, and that in other places we have to concentrate on fighting the Conservatives. And if the electorate deliver us enough votes, then we have to work together to beat the Conservatives, and that's what we're doing. But it's not simplistic, it's complicated, and it requires careful consideration about how we run those elections. And when we got to the position where the Conservatives were no longer in an overall majority, it also required really careful looking at our policy platforms. And that's one of the things that I think we need to talk about a lot, is how we make sure that we are aware of where our policies align and where they don't align. And when we write manifestos, where we think about what is going to be acceptable to our parties and our activists and our voters, but might also be acceptable to the people that we work with. And that's not always going to be easy. But it is work that we have to start early, and we have to start now, and we have to really think about the places and the points where we can make progress on things that we agree on, and maybe how we can get round some of the things that we don't agree on. And on those things that we don't agree, and electoral reform may to some extent be this in some places and in some areas, we have to work out what we can do and what we can't do. And I think the final point that I want to make before I let other people comment again is that we mustn't get completely hung up on electoral reform just being about reforming the House of Commons and reforming MPs' constituencies. There is lots of other parts of our electoral system that we need to really concentrate on electoral reform for. The first of those, really obviously to me, is the second chamber and the House of Lords. We have to get a proportionally elected House of Lords that can really challenge our executive in the House of Commons, because in some ways it will have a stronger mandate than they do. If we have a proportionally elected second chamber, it will be able to hold the executive to account in a way that it is not able to at the moment. And that's really crucial, and is not a second option. It should be one of the first things we're looking at doing. We also need to look at how we get proportional representation in local government, and how we make sure that we keep and improve the proportional representation that we have for mayoral elections in the places where we have mayoral elections. And we have a paper tomorrow on regional government for England, and we need to be thinking about it for that as well. So we mustn't just allow this Progressive Alliance conversation to get completely sidetracked into a who's standing down where conversation, because that is not going to be what leads us to the places where we are able to form that, I hope, progressive government in 2024, maybe 2023, that we all desperately, desperately need. We need to do that by thinking about what works in individual areas, what local parties of what our local parties, what our Liberal Democrat local parties can agree with, what the Labour Party can agree with, what the Greens and the SNP might swallow. All of those things are not, it's not a binary discussion. It's a much more complex discussion than quite often seems to come across. I could talk about much more about what we've been doing in Cambridgeshire, and how what we're doing in Cambridgeshire is not quite the same as what they're doing in Oxfordshire, where they also have a joint administration, but because their local circumstances are slightly different and their partners are slightly different, they have a different relationship. And we need to be really respectful of those local different situations. I'll stop now. Thank you. It's really good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Lucy. And we've got touching on a couple of hundred people on the call. So I think everyone would agree it was well worth waiting for you to join us to speak about what you're doing locally. But I really resonated with me talking about the political reality of different areas and how you've got to address things in different ways, but also how all the reforms are connected to each other. This is a topic where we're up against very powerful interest, and if we're not strategic, then that's sort of glorious defeat territory. So I think you were a great reminder of how it all weaves through together, and I'm glad you could at least hear what our other speakers had to say as well. We're going to open up to Q&A now, but before I do that, just a reminder that in the polls section of the tabs there's if you want to join the mailing list for Liberal Democrats for electoral reform, for Compass, or for the Electoral Reform Society to keep part of this campaign and part of this discussion, would really, the more people we've got, the stronger it will be. As Neal said before, more power to all of our collective elbows in that respect. So Keith and Doug have been keeping a close eye on the questions, and Keith, can you perhaps give us the first question?
Yes. Thank you, Darren. I'll ask the first question. But just on the poll, a lot of questions have come up, particularly about Compass, Neal, which you're not going to have time to answer in the next 25 minutes. So could people who want to know more about Compass just go to that poll and click on Compass, and then Neal will get your details. He'll write to you afterwards. You can discuss, as far as you need to. And obviously, the Society and LDR as well, if you wish to. I thought the first question was to try and get a little bit of definition around what we mean by progressive alliance. Crispin Allard has said, one problem is confusion over what progressive alliance means. And he refers to a recent Mark Pack survey. Mark's our president, of course. And he did a poll. It was quite well responded to. And some people saw a progressive alliance as the Blair, Ashdown, Cook, McLennan deal that Neal and others have referred to in the 90s, was sort of a non-aggression pact of, we'll put candidates up in every constituency, but you really go for that one and we'll pull back, but we'll go for, constituency B. Other people see a progressive alliance as an extension of what I think of as the Unite to Remain campaign that was put together. And I think I'm right in saying that 66 seats were actually decided upon before the 2019 general election between the Greens, Plaid and the Liberal Democrats. So some confusion about what do we actually mean when we talk about a progressive alliance. So perhaps speakers, Darren, you'd like to get speakers to just comment on that. So, we understand the nature of the beast that we're referring to.
Okay, Wendy, would you like to go first on that?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I actually think that a little bit like our parties, I think Neal and I agree on 80% of things. I suppose the question is are we talking about a formal progressive alliance along the lines of Unite to Remain, which, as I said at the outset of my remarks, I'm extremely sceptical about. And actually, I think it potentially does the public a disservice as well. I think it's really important that, people who would vote Liberal Democrat have the opportunity to vote Liberal Democrat. How otherwise do we expect to make progress? Or are we talking about something along the lines of 1997, where there's actually some agreement about where parties work, or if they do work, and I'll go back to Batley and Spend, they do so in a targeted way that actually enables. And I think that falls very well into Lucy's comments about, what I put down in terms of Lucy's comments is, actually what you're doing is, it's your coalition, isn't it? You're working in coalition, and that involves that ongoing conversation, dialogue about where the agreements are and what you do. The other thing I noted was, what is it about the UK that makes us sort of allergic to coalitions? Now, Neal raised the sort of issue of the SNP Greens agreement in Scotland, which they are very, very clear that there is not a coalition. But what we forget is, up until 2011 in Scotland, the Liberal Democrats were part of a coalition, 2007, the Liberal Democrats were part of a coalition with Labour in the Scottish Parliament. And actually, when you look back at some of the key achievements of the Scottish Parliament in its early days, it comes about as a result of that coalition. So, it does, I think, that is one of the sort of, for me, eroding aspects of first past the post, that it actually makes it very difficult to work in a consensual way as a politician. It's one of my favourite things to say. You know, I teach my kids like to get on with people, to work their way through disagreements, not to argue, to find compromise. And I've come to be elected to a place where that seems to be the last thing that often happens. So I think, yeah, I think we need to have a clear definition of that. And I think Labour and where Labour are is a very key part of that, no doubt about it. And I've seen that from the comments here this afternoon in the chat as well.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Neal and then Lucy, and if we can kind of keep the answers to less than a minute, then we can get through a few more questions. And Doug, if you can be ready for the next question when Lucy finishes, you just come in straight away. That'll save a bit of time.
So quickly, I agree with Wendy. It's very complicated to do cooperation in an adversarial system. We have to change our own behaviours. I mean, that's the only thing we can ever change as people, and work that cooperation as hard as we can. In terms of what a progressive alliance is, I think it's all of these things. And I don't think we should dictate what it is to people. I think it can be stand aside if local parties want to do that. And I don't think we should allow the Tory party or their press to bully us into a position to say that that is anti-democratic. If, you know, and these are the upholders of first past the post, you know, they are happy for us not to do stand-asides because they know, like Richmond Park and other places, it can work. I think there are questions about Unite to Remain, but that was a Brexit issue. This is not a Brexit time. This is a different thing. And if parties locally, and you know, this is where Lucy's point about these have to be negotiated and trust built up locally. If they do that and want to stand one candidate, then I think it's their right to do it, and we can defend that on democratic grounds because we want to bring in proportional representation rather than have 70% of people's votes across the whole country wasted. So we shouldn't allow the right to dictate the terms of democracy in our country. So I think it's all of those things, but also we have to think about what happens as a consequence. You know, if there is a Labour-led government, what sort is it? Is it confidence and supply? Is it minority? Is it some form of coalition? Because we can't, you know, go to the country and say we don't know what's going to happen. We've got to have talked some of that stuff through. Compass will be publishing a paper on this soon after the conference season, looking at the different varieties of collaboration, because we've got to be in charge of how multi-party politics can work.
Another good reason to join the mailing list. Lucy.
Thank you. So I think that there are some really useful things that we can do as a progressive alliance, as kind of people who are supportive of each other's messages, and some of those things are about making sure that we keep our national guns trained on the real opposition, so that rather than attacking each other, we are making sure that we're regularly focusing not on each other, but on the Conservatives, because they are running the country. They are the ones causing absolutely astonishing problems and have caused an extraordinary situation of disaster for our country. And looking at the skills shortages that we're facing across the country, the empty shelves, all of those things, we need to be making sure that we're all talking about the same things, echoing the same messages, and not knocking seven bells out of one another, which is definitely one of the things that has happened in the not too distant past. So I think that's really important. I would echo Neal's point about allowing local parties a certain amount of flexibility, but I think that for all those parties, they'll need to discuss that with their national groups and work out what's acceptable and what isn't. But there shouldn't be neither the Progressive Alliance nor anybody else like the Daily Mail should be dictating that. It should be because different places are different, and we have had, Layla's seat is an example where there have been positive outcomes from people talking to each other. Batley and Spen is another really, really good example of a place where by standing we probably helped swing the result for Labour, and we need to be really clear that that happens sometimes, and that it's not always unhelpful to have a candidate. So I think all of those points are really important, but what's absolutely crucial is that we don't spend too much time attacking each other, and we make sure that we're attacking the Conservatives, because there is so much danger of progressives attacking each other because they're not quite progressive enough in the right direction or in the right place, and we need to try and do as little as that as possible.
Looking at the questions, we've got a question here from Samuel Jackson. Labour Party conferences will be coming up next weekend. And he asks, would Labour support a specific system of PR or PR in general principle, if at all? So it might be a good opportunity to see what the panel think about the chances of Labour adopting policies in favour of PR. I don't know, Neal, whether with your knowledge in this area, it might be a good one for you to start.
So, I mean, I think first we have to recognise that there has been a groundswell change of mood, certainly amongst the grassroots, the membership and the constituencies in Labour. I've been banging the drum for PR, as you can probably imagine, in the Labour Party for all my life. It's been like banging my head against the wall. But something has switched and something has changed. It's partly a recognition of that, you know, we don't think we can win alone, but it's partly, you know, the context of the 21st century of a plural, negotiated, you know, world. So, you know, now when polled, 83% of Labour Party members say they support PR. There's been this huge bandwagon of CLPs passing resolutions. Any CLP that debates proportional representation passes the motion, the length and breadth of the country. Now, often with all of our progressive parties, the nearer you get to the centre, the more tribal they can be. And I think that works, you know, sometimes across the board. It's not just Labour. And I don't know yet whether Keir Starmer is going to allow that kind of wave of support for PR to wash its way through Brighton and become party policy. The ball is in his court. He can stop it through the trade unions if he asks for them to stop it. So it's going to be an incredibly revealing moment. Whatever it is, it won't be for a specific system. It will be for, you know, the motion is for PR, you know, and then for systems to be looked at. Labour as a party is very wedded to the constituency link. And if we end up with an AMS style system, I would be more than happy with that. We see it working, you know, effectively in Scotland, you know, etc. So the Labour Party conference is going to be incredibly revealing. What I would say, if, you know, hopefully they're going to pass it, hopefully then we can build off of that. And then, you know, it's not done then, it's just party policy. Then we've got to get it prominently in the manifesto. And then we've got to have this progressive alliance approach, this complex progressive alliance approach to get a government that can actually pass it and prioritise it then. I mean, then I think if we've got all the progressive parties having PR in their manifesto, we don't have to go to a referendum. We might use some kind of assembly to decide on the system, and then Parliament would pass, you know, the system. I don't want another referendum on PR. Thank you very much. But I think we have a democratic mandate if all the parties can do that. And that goes back to the essay question of this fringe meeting. You know, tell me someone from the audience or anywhere how else we're going to get PR than through the route that I've just kind of described. Because there's this magic relationship between PR and a PA. That if Labour supports a proportional representation, then you've got the beginnings of a progressive alliance. A progressive alliance is the only way we can win. And then when we've won, we can pass PR, and then we can go about politics in a modern 21st century way. So that's the route of travel. You know, our job between now and the next election is to make that happen.
Thanks, Neal. I think that because it was specifically about the Labour conference and you're going to be there, I think we might just leave that in. Keith, maybe we'll go to another question that Wendy and Lucy can come in on, first of all.
Yes, this is to do with sort of the circumstances coming up. One question is the potential winter of discontent in the public sector a possible kind of groundswell for a move towards proportional representation? And kind of linked to that, there's another question, I think, from Fiona, who said, can we get the trade unions on side? How do we do that? There's another knock-on one as well, which I'm trying to wrap a few questions together here because there's a lot of them. There is a question in there about, is it inevitable that we couldn't win another referendum on PR? Sorry, a referendum on PR. I've never had a referendum on PR. So 3 linked areas there. Is there a winter of discontent coming that might get the public mood, trade unions more oriented to PR? And is it a foregone conclusion that we couldn't win were there to be a referendum, not a citizens' assembly or an assembly the way that Neal was saying?
Thanks, Keith. Wendy, can we start with you? And we're going to try and get through a few more questions before we wrap up in a few minutes.
Yeah, I'll try and be very clear. I suppose trade unions, probably Neal's better placed to comment, but obviously I know the Union Unite leader was the only candidate who was particularly in support of proportional representation, and she's also indicated that she won't be as, they're not going to be as politically potentially orientated with Labour as they've maybe been in the past. Referendums for me are the ultimate first past the post in some respects, aren't they? So I would want to try and get to a place of consensus without resorting to that. Having experienced within a decade, I'm kind of a bit done with them personally. And the winter of discontent, I think what potentially we'll see from that is maybe a fall in the government support, which will have a bearing on whether we're going to see a general election in May 2023, as some people have said, or and potentially what we'll see is an increase in Labour support. And then I think potentially Labour might have got themselves back into the dialogue of they don't need anybody else to win. So I'm not convinced that it can actually help us from a PR perspective. And I very much hope it doesn't happen, because we all and the most vulnerable will be affected.
Thanks, Wendy. Lucy?
Thank you. On the winter of discontent question and what happens in the next general election, I can't help feeling that the next general election is going to be a referendum on Boris Johnson. And that's why I think keeping all our messaging and all our kind of focus on what this government is doing, and his government, and it is clearly now his government, is doing to this country is absolutely crucial. We absolutely need to make sure that we're all focused on that message of the damage that is being done and the extraordinary way that they're breaking promises, piling the costs of the pandemic on those least able to afford them, etc., etc. That messaging is absolutely crucial, and that's really what will make the biggest difference in terms of referendums and what type of PR and all that kind of thing. I think it's really important we don't get too sidetracked by that. I think that the people in this room could probably spend many days discussing what type of PR. The public are absolutely not interested, and we should not be having a referendum on it. We should be saying that we want to have proportional representation and we want to have more democratic government, not just in the House of Commons, as I've mentioned before, but also throughout our democratic system. And we really need to make sure that we're looking across that system at how we make sure that minorities are better represented and smaller groups are better represented. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lucy. And Neal, do you want to give us 30 seconds on the trade unions? Because I think that is an interesting dynamic. We've been doing a lot of work with you and other groups on that the last few years, and it might be interesting to the audience.
Yeah, and thanks for the work the ERS are doing with the trade unions, and that is beginning to bear fruit. The election of Sharon Graham to the General Secretaryship of Unite is absolutely pivotal. Unfortunately, it happened quite late in the day, and we don't know what effect she's going to have at the Labour Party conference. But if she can change Unite policy, and that will be a big impact in of itself, but also on the Labour Party. And we can see the cracks even in the old, clunky, mechanical, rusty trade union, movement. Towards PR, so that's got to be welcome. I would just come back to Wendy and say I don't want referendums for anything. The one point about Brexit is that everyone's vote counted, and people knew their vote counted, and it showed them how much power democracy can have when your vote actually counts, and that's why the turnout was 75%, and Brexit was a kind of democratic revolution to some degree that we ought to recognise and be able to kind of plough back into a proper, deeper democratic sentiment, and not one that was, abused by populists. And I welcome the fact that lots of people voted then that have never voted before. And how can we give them reasons to vote in the future that are going to change their life? And how do we link proportional representation to things about their jobs, about climate, about their locality, etc. when we do that? Because there's lots of pressure to make the Progressive Alliance a democratic alliance. Just run it on PR. And I think we get taken to the cleaners if we just say this is all about how we count people's votes. I desperately want PR, but it has to be mixed up with other things that relate to people's lives.
Thanks, Neal. Doug, what have you got next for a question? We'll probably got time for a couple more.
We've got a few questions here about what's being done to work with other parties. So it might be a good one for Wendy as our resident parliamentarian to answer about the work that's being done in Westminster.
Thanks very much. I think obviously, and Neil, yeah, I do accept your comments around turnout. Obviously, it was the same with the Scottish independence referendum in 2014. I think the issue is always around the quality of the information that people get for making those decisions, and I'm sure for both those referendums, I think we failed the electorate in that regard. What's happening at Westminster? I think we are sort of fighting on a bill by bill basis with the portmanteau of what the Conservative government brought through their manifesto. We've seen the constituencies bill, which is redrawing the 650 seats, and every vote is counting equally by making constituencies the same size. We're also then, as part of that, bringing in the Overseas Voters Act, which we would be supportive of in terms of allowing overseas voters to vote in the UK. But instead of creating overseas constituencies, as the Lib Dems would want to see, we're just going to add these into these equal number of seats and then create an unknown, and local authorities don't hold that information. So we're going to have an unknown number of overseas voters in each of those seats, which is going to make them unequal again. That's great. We obviously know about voter ID coming in through the elections bill, and I mentioned earlier that the government plans to introduce first past the post to mayoral and PCC elections through that. So it's actually, from a Westminster perspective, from a legislative perspective, it is just trying to push back against what the government are trying to do. On the other hand, I do think, I would call out ERS, Make Votes Matter, that is trying to obviously change opinion, move the dialogue within parties, and the APPG for Electoral Reform has reconstituted itself in this session of Parliament, chaired by a Labour MP, so that can only be a good thing. But yeah, it's not the happiest of news from Westminster, I have to say, sadly.
Can I add a bit?
Thank you, Wendy. At least some good things are happening.
If I add a bit onto that, Darren, I mean, I think nowhere near enough is being done. I mentioned earlier that Ashdown and Blair, I mean, they were having dinner virtually every night with Roy Jenkins. There was a real kind of, we're not sure, we can't say, but between us, don't tell anyone outside of this call. We're not sure that Starmer and Ed have ever actually met in person, and that's not a good thing. Right? That's really not a good thing. There is a kind of tacit non-aggression pact between the two media offices, and that's a good thing. And there was some conversations around Batley and Spen and around Chesham and Amersham. That's a good thing, but it needs to go much deeper. Compass convenes on a regular basis a group of cross-party MPs from Labour, Clive Lewis, Caroline Lucas, Layla Moran, Tommy Shepherd from the SNP, people from Pride, and from the Progressive Northern Ireland parties as well. And we're trying to do as much as we can to build relationships and trust and get people working together, but it's got to be done on an industrial scale between now and the election if we're going to send the signals to the country that we broadly agree with each other, we broadly like each other, and we can broadly work with each other in the interests of the country. And so there is an onus on our political leaders to do much, much more and not be scared of saying what they believe in, who they want to work with, and in effect, who they want to be Prime Minister at the next election. Because I go back to, there's only two choices. And how do we get the progressive one and get PR and everything else we want with it? We've got to do that work.
Thank you very much. We've got 3 minutes left. I've got a question for Lucy only, just on a local government perspective. If you could do a brief as possible, because I want to then throw back to Keith Sharp from LD to close us out. And I know Wendy's got another fringe to go to right after this. So even these virtual conferences are just as busy as what they're like when we're in person. But we've had a question in, can you suggest a framework of how to have these cross-party discussions at a local level, and is now the time to start?
Yes, it's definitely the time to start. It's always the time to start. I think that the first thing that you have to do, the first probably really important thing is to make sure that you've got decent personal relationships, and this is what Neal was talking about in Westminster, that actually that personal sense of trust between different groups and different leaders, even if you're fighting each other, as we are fighting Labour in Cambridge, there's a sense of kind of respect and of a sense that everybody is trying to do the best thing for the city, even if we disagree on kind of elements of it. And that sense of mutual respect, even among those from different parties, is really important. And it comes from personal relationships. And if you've got some members of the groups or some members who just spend all the time being absolutely vile to each other in the chamber and on Twitter, you're not going to get anywhere. And then after that, you've got to do the policy. But actually, it's no good having the policy alignment if the people don't get on.
I like each other. Well, thank you very much, Lucy, for that. I'm sorry to squeeze you, but we wanted to hear from you because you missed out on the first part. Wendy, you go when you need to. Neal and Lucy, big thanks to you. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And Keith Sharp from LDER will close us off before we boot it off. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Darren. On behalf of Liberal Democrats for Electoral Reform, could I thank all of our speakers, I think the just departed Wendy, but also Lucy and Neal, for really, I think, cracking open and starting to explore what is going to be a key issue if we are going to stop the Tories at the next general election. So there's lots more to be done on this, but that's really got to really appreciate it. Could I also thank Darren and the Electoral Reform Society, Darren and his team, for co-hosting and sponsoring this event. And just a quick plug for our poll. There's been quite a good reaction to it. I've seen quite a few good numbers on there. Please do go in and find out more about ERS or Compass or LDER. Quick final plug for us. We've got a lot of things going on. We have another fringe meeting on Monday evening at 10 to 6. This one is with Unlock Democracy and Make Votes Matter. And it's about can campaigning for democracy also win votes. And a little further down the track, LDR is holding a fringe at the Scotland-Wales conference on the 9th of October. And on the 12th of October, we have a Zoom meeting on diversity, inclusion and electoral reform with Hina Bakari, our new London Assembly member, and Lord Paul Tyler. So thank you all again, and please fill in that poll so you can hear more from us. We weren't able to get to all of the questions and all of the chats, but leave your details. I've also put the websites of the three organisations into the chat, and we'll try our best to follow up. But thank you all again for speaking. Thank you for the persistence in getting on. And again, thank you to the Electoral Reform Society for helping us run this.
Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye. Thank you.